We're now going to take a look at the changes to ecosystems in Vue 8, and also some of the changes since and in 7.5. The first thing we're going to take a look at is the new shading mode. And if you're using, under File Options, the Shader 4, and you have compatibility with it, then your new default previewing mode for ecosystems is going to be the shaded billboard. And in the scene I currently have, it's just kind of a jungle scene. And if we take a look, we can see the default quality is shaded billboard. And I also have display full quality near camera on right now. So you can see the full quality of the plant and then the transition into that shaded billboard. So if you have the option to use this, it is really quite an amazing previewing system. And I'm going to go ahead and just zoom out to get away from the terrain, and we can start to see that shaded mode. What it'll do is create the polygons that will face the camera a little more. It does have two different modes or displays that you'll see. One would be displayed from when you're looking above and down onto the ecosystem. And then once you start to lift it up, it will show the more side view. But we can see that overall the quality is really good. I'm going to go ahead and turn off that full quality near camera so that we can just look at the shaded mode. So now everything we're viewing is no longer fixed geometry, or it shouldn't be. I'm going to go ahead and double check. And I do need to turn off the other layer as well, so that it's shaded quality, the shaded billboard, and not the full quality. So now we're seeing just the shaded billboard, which does react correctly with lighting. And you can see specular values showing up. It's a really great previewing system. So even if you're using xStream integrated and you want to switch over to the standalone version for a bit to be able to really see the ecosystems a little better, so I would definitely suggest using the standalone, even if xStream integrated, or using xStream integrated for really precisely modifying ecosystems, just because this shaded billboard really will reduce the amount of preview renders you need to make. And if you're using standalone or Infinite, the display options for ecosystem painting also give you the option to use the shaded billboard. So very cool. Some changes have also been made to the ecosystem painter and global ecosystems. And what I'm going to do, just so that I don't have to load in a distribution into the ecosystem painter and the global ecosystem, I'm going to open up the ecosystem selector and select some of the populated instances, just to grab some different plants, and then choose under the manipulate pull down, move instances to global ecosystem. And this will automatically give us the ability to populate and paint with those instances, and that way you don't have to load them in again. It's a nice way to switch back and forth. Now, because I haven't actually painted anything, we're not going to see the new object yet. So first I'm just going to go ahead and clear that current population. And now just kind of brush in. Go ahead and undo that. Maybe reduce the flow here so it's not creating so many. And just paint in some of these plants. And now we can see we have a new global ecosystem object. This allows us to directly manipulate the instances using the size tool, rotate, also move, So if we want, we could switch to move and move these up into the scene. This gives us a much easier way to directly edit any of the painted ecosystem objects without having to use the ecosystem selector to grab the global ecosystem. It's also a quick and easy way to select, since when we're using the ecosystem selector, it's going to select every single ecosystem being displayed. So if we only want to really select objects within that global ecosystem, once we select the object, those instances are automatically selected. So we can go to the ecosystem selector, see that 396 of the almost 11,000 that are in this scene are selected. So now if I want to refine this selection, I can go deselect and deselect some of those. And now we know we're just working with that global ecosystem. So that's a really nice change. And all of that is still going to move together regardless of the ecosystem selector. Unless we wanted to go in and choose manipulate, and then we can modify and use the gizmo to just manipulate those instances, or convert them to objects if we want to use the convert to actual objects tool, or we can move them over to one of the material ecosystems, or even change all of these instances to one specific type. So let's just go ahead and change these all to one type of plant, and now they're all that same type of plant that I went over and moved it to. So it's a nice, useful tool. Unfortunately, it is not available within xStream Integrated. This global ecosystem object will not show up within your host application. I also want to note you cannot connect any graphs or anything to it. It's really just for that manipulation overall of the global ecosystem, and a really nice way to just pull out that object and separate it from the rest of the ecosystem population. So I'm going to continue using this scene, and first what I'm going to do is select the material for the ecosystem, just using the Materials tab, because I do have a couple of terrains, but they have all the same ecosystem. I'm going to go ahead and switch everything over to Dynamic Population. So both of those ecosystem layers, and of course that painted ecosystem, I'm going to go ahead and just clear out. So just like in View 7, what we're seeing is now with Dynamic Population, there's no preview. Now, the change in View 8 is if we go to File and Options, and we have Preview Dynamic Ecosystems turned on, we can set the amount of instances to display, and also a minimum size displayed instance in pixels. And this is going to be based on the range of the image and the overall scale to really help reduce previewing objects that would be near the horizon, very, very small, if you had a huge ecosystem population. Of course, at render time, it's still going to show all the way in the distance. It's just more about the previewing. So once I go ahead and click to render, even just a preview render, once that first pass goes across, and we're just going to see the normal bucket rendering, and I can just cancel it, and now we're going to see the dynamic populated ecosystem. So if we take a look in the top view, we can see the camera and where the view extents are, and see that the population is also going a little bit beyond the camera. So this way we can preview dynamic ecosystems and the dynamic population without having to switch back and forth between population modes if you want to see it in your scene. And anytime you make a change to the ecosystem, it will remove the preview, so you will have to re-render. But most of the time you're rendering to check it out anyway. Before we move on and take a look at the changes within the material editor, I want to show another feature that was introduced in Vue 7.5, and I've just loaded in a scene to demonstrate this. And basically what it is the animation of ecosystem density. And I just have a little bit of an animation set up where I'm using Advanced Sphere Zone, which is a tool I created that's part of asileFX Snowflake version 2, which is also known as the MetaNode collection. This tool subtracts or really just controls a number output based on the scale and position of a sphere. So the animation is a sphere kind of stretching out across over this terrain and slightly moving. And if you take a look, you can also see in the preview on the bottom that I've already rendered out around a 5-second or 5 frame per second animation to demonstrate how the dynamic population, the ecosystem density is changing over time. So it is a dynamic population option. You do need to be using dynamic population for this. Since I do have the preview turned on, we can go ahead and do a quick render, and now we can see that showing up. And I'm going to go ahead and just hide the sphere from the scene, and we can take a look at the population. So as we move through the animation, it's going to update and properly subtract from the density. Now, the difference between this kind of a method and, let's say, using a decay near foreign objects is decay near foreign objects does not work for animated density. If we take a look in the material editor and move over to density, I am using a variable density where we're going to see the Advanced Sphere Zone metanode, the connection to the size and position of the sphere. And I'm using most of the default settings, except I do have the output inverted. So really what this is doing, if we take a look in the function node preview, is you can see that change and that dip, which is a subtraction within the density. So it does need to be controlled within the function editor. And the reason you're seeing this dip so far on some of the axes and not so much on the other is because the Z height is also part of sphere zone, which means we can take the sphere, and if we move it up, then everything will still be populated. So I could essentially just also kind of put this through the terrain and it will subtract, because it is completely dependent on the position, and it'll work with materials, terrains, a lot of different things. So it's pretty cool. And you can see that little bit of subtraction within the animated preview on the bottom. I do want to note that this is really best for removing large areas of ecosystem. Typically something you would do fairly quickly, and making sure there's somewhat of a consistent edge around the subtraction. Now the reason for this is the way the population works will depend on what's in previous frames and what's part of the current population. So if we take a look, and I'm just going to go ahead and go to animation, destroy object animation to get rid of it. I've also got animated keyframes on the camera. Destroy object animation. And I'm going to go ahead and scale this up. And basically, for the animation and the way the density is going to work, Vue is going to look at what population is currently there. Now, if in the next frame we move this over, it's going to populate, of course, where the new existing area has been opened up and removed from the other area. If we were to pull this back and put it where it was before, we're not necessarily going to see the exact same population, because it's now resampling and figuring out an entirely new placement for the ecosystem. You can increase the sampling quality, go back into the ecosystem, and raise up the sampling quality to get something a little bit closer, but in View 8 the sampling quality has changed completely. Before it was a quality boost, that was really an increase of density. It still kind of behaves the same, and the purpose of the sampling quality is to conform to the defined density and or environment settings, to allow it to go a little bit closer to what you have defined. If you're using images, it'll go a little bit closer to the edges based on the contrast. But now in View 8, this has changed. The sampling quality will now work more like force regular alignment of instances, which was previously a way to create rows of objects and rows of instances, and it still does that as well. I'm going to go ahead, turn off dynamic population, and just move the sphere out of the impact zone. We'll go ahead and open up the ecosystem. We can go ahead and populate. I'm going to thin this out a bit and turn off variable density for now. And if I go ahead and increase that sampling quality, we're going to start to see rows. And it's going to really work a lot more like the force regular alignment of instances. If I populate that, it's going to be almost a complete grid of objects where we have exact rows. Turn that off, and it's really kind of doing the same thing now with the new sampling quality. Personally, I hate it. There are some issues and restrictions now because of this. If I wanted to create rows, I would use force regular alignment of instances and not increase sampling quality, which before was, I think, a little more accurate. So now the sampling quality, we'll go ahead and increase the density a little. I'm just going to reset this filter to make sure there's no impact. So we can reduce the sampling quality. So going from, let's say, -4 to 0, repopulate, there's no change. So in a way, it really is more like a realistic sampling quality, or the way quality boosts will work within View. But the only problem is once we start raising it up a little higher, we're not really increasing the quality. We're just conforming everything to a grid. And it completely removes the randomness. And like I was saying, force regular alignment of instances was the main tool for that. So now, having the two of these, even if you use force regular alignment of instances and turn down the sampling quality, it's going to look exactly the same. So, yeah, personally, I just don't like this feature and the changes made. It is going to impact and modify previous scenes that you might load in that you've created in other versions of View, back 7.5, 7, 6, even 5. And any of those scenes you load in, unless they are already populated, once you repopulate them, they're going to be different. Another thing that has changed is before the sampling quality was a way to have an extra density, a way to overmax the density and really fill up a terrain with a bunch of trees if you wanted to. This was a technique I used for tree ecosystem creation, and now the sampling quality at +4 is as high as it will go. You raise it to 8, populate, it's going to go right back to 0.4 or +4. So you can no longer increase that amount any higher than the slider allows, which also means that the overall density will need much higher values if you want to create those very, very dense ecosystems. So if I go ahead and raise this up to 2,000 and populate, we're going to see 32,000 instances. Let's bring it down to 200. And the difference is 22,000. And 100, it's 19,000. Not that big of an increase considering we just had it set at 2,000. So now it requires much higher values in order to really get the densest population possible. And we can see setting it to 40,000 has only increased it to 44,000 instances. Increasing sampling quality just conforms it to that grid. So some things that were possible before may not be possible now without creating additional ecosystem layers and then setting up the same populations. So, I mean, you could go and copy the layer, add new layer, paste that ecosystem layer in, but it does create some restrictions, unfortunately. I am trying to get the old feature back, or the ability to choose between the two, because right now there's really no point in this sampling quality. I hate to say it, but I just very much dislike it. I'm going to go ahead and load in a scene that kind of takes advantage of some of the old system. We could take a look at the change. This scene is a tree ecosystem I created, and if you're not familiar with tree ecosystems, it's really just a name I came up for populating other ecosystem or other vegetation onto leafless vegetation, bare trunk trees, things like that. So these are two different solid growth, or a couple of different solid growth plants. And this is my crabapple. So this is a render of it. We can see it 100%. A lot of detail because of the intense amount of geometry. And if we take a look, that there's currently 252 million polygons just creating this tree. So using the normal map preview and the shaded billboard, we can really see the detail without having to render. And of course, let's go ahead and take a look. First of all, I just want to note that I am using just the Bonnie Clump plant for this to create the petals and the leaves. I have a couple of different variations, and what I did was just create some flowers, which is one of the plants. Another is some leaves with the flowers, and one's just leaves. And there's different color areas in order to create what looks like crab apples, having some purple variations showing up. And this was really just kind of a starter. Didn't end up creating or getting into creating more realistic looking petals. I just kind of used one of the presets. From farther away it looks really good. Close up it still looks better than most of the plants available in view. But let's go ahead and take a look at the ecosystem, which is on the branch material of this tree, which is the leafless tree down. What we can see is that we have 14,000 instances being generated from only an overall density of 1,200. Well, I'm going to go ahead and populate this again, and now we've lost almost all of them. It's down to 3,000, so about halfway to 4,000. But now if I increase this value, let's go ahead and bring it up to 4,000, populate. Now we're at 7,000 instances, bring it up to 50,000, and it's also making some strange scale changes. But really, depending on the plant, it can take a lot more to fill it in. So, I mean, there also are some advantages. If I set the sampling quality up a little bit higher, in this case, a grid might be a little bit better. It might look a little bit better. But overall, I mean, it is going to change your existing scenes if you want to repopulate, make modifications. Also, the instances seem to be a lot less random. And we'll just take a look at one other one real quick. Now, this is another tree I created. I'm not going to be rendering it. We can see it pretty well within the display to see what it looks like. Go ahead and maybe modify the sun a little, and you can see the change and the amount of depth overall on this tree. And if we take a look at the ecosystem, which is on a branch, there's 7,400 instances, and I did have to use a density of 4,000 in order to get to that point. I also have forced regular alignment of instances on, which does allow you to get much closer to these high populations without extreme numbers. So we're at 7,400 instances. I'm going to populate, and it's cut it down to 1,800. So that's kind of a big change. Turn off forced regular alignment of instances. It's going to bring it down to 391 with the density of 4,000. And looking in the environment tab, it's pretty much opened all the way. So there are a lot of changes that do need to be made to previous scenes. Increasing the sampling quality in this case no longer increases the amount of instances unless forced regular alignment of instances is turned off. So in this case I would have to bring it up. Let's try 40,000, and now we're getting a little bit closer. So it just requires kind of ridiculous values in order to get to what was very easy before, which also means there's more room for error. So that's kind of a drawback of the new system. I just thought I'd mention it because I have shown this technique before, and I find it to be the only way to create extremely realistic close-up vegetation from the solid growth species that is compatible with the wind and breeze system. So being able to interact with ventilators and so on, just as long as the plant itself, the tree that's being populated, isn't moving as part of the wind. So let's just take a look at a couple of other changes that have been made. Besides the obvious just change of the placement, and that populate below foreign objects as possible has now been completely integrated into the decaner foreign objects, which was its original intent, and that's what it was really meant for. Was when there was a subtraction from a foreign object, it would try to populate underneath things like overhangs. So now that's moved in there. If we take a look in the color tab, we can see the filter has been removed for filtering the color map. So if you need to, you can just add a filter to whatever density you want to run. So if you did need to filter out that density amount, you can do it that way. One really nice change is if we go over to the General tab, the display options are now independent of each other per ecosystem layer. So if I add another ecosystem layer, I'll go ahead and move it up above the existing layer. Let's go ahead and add a plant. And we'll add the maple tree. Go ahead and scale it down. We can see it on the branches. Previously, if we were to use dynamic population, say, it would change every layer to dynamic population, and we were completely restricted to the entire material being that type of population. Well, now we have more control over the ecosystem layers. So now this leaves layer is dynamically populated. The layer above is a standard population, which means I can also go over to the General tab and just show all of these as smooth shaded objects, full quality, all of their geometry showing in the viewport, and not have to worry about it affecting, in this case, what would be my leaf tree ecosystem, which would be not something I would suggest displaying in the OpenGL, just because it was almost 1 billion polygons. Now I can populate this, and now we'll see the dynamically populated ecosystem, and then along with our shaded full quality layer that's slightly above it. So having independent quality changes and previews, along with being able to set either dynamic population or a fixed population per layer instead of being restricted to a material, that's a huge, huge improvement. And that's pretty much it for the ecosystem changes in Vue 8 and the new features of 7.5. The only other improvement would be previewing some of the plants in the plant editor. Mainly the leaves, although the overall display quality of most of the plants has been improved. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new scene. Just load in one of these plants. And now I'm going to use one of my tropical plants. And if we take a look, we're going to see a much better OpenGL preview in the plant editor. Other than that, that's really the only change, is just kind of the display quality. But still some very, very useful new tools.